Edward Harrison's fist slammed into my face like a sledgehammer, snapping my head to the side with a sickening crack. The sharp sound sliced through the festive hum of the Harrison family's Christmas party, silencing the clinking of champagne glasses and the soft jingle of holiday music. For a frozen moment, the world stopped. Blood trickled from my nose, warm and metallic, staining my lips as I stumbled backward, clutching the edge of a velvet armchair to steady myself. 70 pairs of eyes, Boston's elite, draped in tailored suits and glittering gowns, stared at me in horrified silence. The 12-foot Christmas tree in the corner of the Beacon Hill mansion twinkled merrily, its golden ornaments mocking the crimson drip on my chin. The chandelier, above a cascade of imported crystal, caught the light and threw it across the Italian marble floor, where a puddle of water from my spilled glass glistened like evidence of my crime. "You clumsy fool!" Edward roared, his voice booming through the room, adorned with golden garlands and wreaths. "This shirt costs more than your entire paycheck." The damp stain on his pristine white shirt spread slowly, a minor offense that had just cost me my dignity. "My name is Ethan Tran. I'm 32, a Vietnamese-American contractor who builds homes for a living. And I'd just been punched in the face by my father-in-law in front of Boston's high society at the Harrison family's annual Christmas gala. My nose throbbed, swelling under my fingers as I touched it gingerly. The metallic taste of blood filled my mouth, but it was the weight of every gaze in the room that hit harder. Lawyers, doctors, city, counselors, all watching the lowly bricklayer who dared marry into the Harrison dynasty. I scanned the crowd for Claire, my wife of 3 years. She stood by the fireplace, radiant in a $2,000 red gown that hugged her like a second skin. Her face, though, wasn't twisted in shock at her father's violence. It was etched with shame. "Shame of me, Ethan," she said, her voice as cold as the December wind howling outside the mansion's stained glass windows. "You need to apologize to my father. Now." Her words cut deeper than Edward's fist, each syllable a betrayal sharper than the last. Whispers spread like wildfire through the room. "The nerve of him," a woman in pearls muttered, clutching her champagne flute. "Marrying Claire was his ticket to the good life," a man in a tuxedo sneered, his voice low, but loud enough for me to hear. Edward stood, with his arms crossed his damp shirt, a badge of my supposed incompetence. His lips curled into a cruel smirk, one that told me this wasn't about water. It was about power. About reminding me I'd never belong in their world. I wiped the blood from my nose with the back of my hand, my eyes locked on Edward's. The silence stretched heavy and suffocating as the crowd waited to see if I'd grovel or walk away. For 3 years I'd swallowed their insults, Edward's jabs about my dirty hands, his wife Lillian's snide remarks about my charming accent, the constant reminders that I was just a contractor who'd gotten lucky with their princess. I'd always believed Claire would stand by me when it mattered, that our love could bridge the chasm between my calloused hands and her family's millions. I was wrong. The pain in my nose, Astasia. "You're right," I said, my voice steady, despite the blood still dripping down my chin. "I don't belong here." I straightened, forcing a smile that felt like a blade against my own pride. "And I'm done pretending I do." Without another word, I turned and walked toward the grand double doors of the mansion. No shouting, no slamming doors, no begging. Just the soft click of my worn work boots on the marble floor, echoing in the stunned silence. Behind me, murmurs of surprise rippled through the crowd, Boston's elite caught off guard by the bricklayer's quiet defiance. What they didn't know was that I'd been preparing for this moment for 6 months. Small signs had been piling up like snowdrifts. Claire's late-night phone calls she brushed off as work, Edward's cryptic comments about securing the family's future, the way Lillian's eyes lingered on me with pity or contempt. They'd been plotting to push me out of Claire's life, to erase me like a smudge on their polished legacy. As I stepped into the icy Boston night, the snow crunching under my feet, I wasn't just leaving a party. I was walking away from a battlefield, one I'd been fighting on long before Edward's fist met my face. The drive to my modest apartment in Dorchester was a blur, the taste of blood still sharp in my mouth. But it wasn't the punch that stung. It was Claire's voice, cold and final, choosing her father's world over ours. As the city lights flickered through the snow-covered streets, I tightened my grip on the steering wheel. They thought they'd broken me. They had no idea of the Christmas gift I'd been wrapping for them, a gift that would unravel their empire thread by gilded thread. The snow fell harder as I drove through Boston's frozen streets, the taste of blood still lingering in my mouth. My nose throbbed, but it was the memory of Claire's cold eyes that burned deeper. 3 years ago, I thought marrying her meant I'd found a partner, a family, a future. Instead, I'd stepped into a gilded cage, surrounded by wolves in designer suits. The Harrisons didn't just want me gone. They wanted me erased my existence, scrubbed from their perfect world. It started subtly, like poison seeping into a well. When Claire and I began dating, Edward Harrison tolerated me, his smirk dripping with condescension. A contractor, he'd said, swirling a $500 bottle of bourbon at his Back Bay penthouse. How quaint. He thought I was a phase of fling for his spoiled daughter to rebel against the family's expectations. Claire, with her Ivy League degree and diamond-studded upbringing, was their princess destined for a life of galas and private jets. I was the guy who laid bricks for her father's empire, my hands calloused from years of pouring concrete in Dorchester. Edward's wife Lillian was worse. Her smiles were sharp as broken glass, her words laced with venom. At our engagement dinner, she leaned across the mahogany table, her $50,000 diamond necklace glinting under the chandelier. "Ethan, dear," she purred, "do you ever feel out of place among us? Your accent is so charmingly authentic." The room laughed, their polite chuckles masking the insult. Claire squeezed my hand under the table, but her silence spoke louder than her touch. The real assault came after we married. Edward showered Claire with gifts I could never match: a $20, $1,000 Hermes bag, a $50,000 sapphire ring, a weekend in Paris, just because. Each present was a jab, a reminder that I couldn't give her the life she was meant for. "You're too proud," Ethan, Claire started saying, her voice tinged with frustration. "Why won't you take Dad's loan and grow your business? Pride doesn't pay for our future." I saw it then, the seeds of doubt Edward had planted sprouting in her eyes. She was slipping away, pulled by the gravity of her family's wealth. Then there was Dennis Langston, Edward's closest ally, and a Boston city councilor with a smile as oily as his bridal-creamed hair. I met him at a charity gala for a children's hospital, where he clapped me on the shoulder like we were old pals. "Stick to laying bricks, kid," he said loud enough for the nearby crowd to hear. "Leave the big deals to the real men." The room tittered and Claire's cheeks flushed, but she said nothing. Dennis was the muscle behind Edward's real estate empire, securing city contracts with a wink and a handshake. Together, they were untouchable, or so they thought. 6 months ago, the cracks in my marriage became impossible to ignore. It was Claire's 30th birthday, and Edward rented out an entire restaurant in Back Bay for a party that cost more than my annual income. I wore my only suit, a clearance rack find, while every other man sported custom-tailored Armani. During his toast, Edward raised a glass to Claire, his voice dripping with pride. "My daughter followed her heart," he said, pausing to glance at me, "but I trust she'll soon find someone truly her equal." The crowd laughed, thinking it was charming. Claire smiled, her eyes avoiding mine. That night, I knew they were plotting to cut me out. The first blow landed a month later. I found a text on Claire's phone, one she thought she'd deleted. It was from Thomas Whitman, heir to Whitman Construction, the second largest firm in Massachusetts. Looking forward to dinner, it read, "Your dad says you're ready to talk about the future." My stomach churned. Edward wasn't just undermining me, he was arranging a replacement. When I confronted Claire, she brushed it off. "It was just business, Ethan. Dad thinks Thomas could help us. Help us, or help her forget me." Her eyes, once warm, were now as cold as the marble in her father's mansion. The final straw came 3 weeks ago when I found a document in Edward's home office during a family dinner. It was a financial report for a Harrison charity, Hope for Orphans, meant to fund housing for Boston's homeless kids. But the numbers didn't add up. Millions funneled through shell companies, contracts awarded to non-existent firms. My heart sank as I realized the truth Edward and Dennis were using a children's charity to launder money. The same man who punched me for spilling water was stealing from orphans to pad his empire. In America, where charity is sacred, this was a betrayal that would make anyone's blood boil. That discovery lit a fire in me. I wasn't just fighting for my marriage anymore. I was fighting for every kid who'd been cheated, every worker Edward had exploited, every lie he'd built his fortune on. As I pulled into my Dorchester apartment, the snow piling high against the windshield, I knew one thing for certain: the Harrisons had underestimated the wrong man. They thought they could break me with a punch and a few cruel words. But I'd been sharpening my own blade for months, and it was time to cut deeper than they ever could. The snow clung to my windshield as I parked outside my Dorchester apartment, the bitter cold seeping into my bones. My nose still ached from Edward's fist, but it was the sting of Claire's betrayal that kept me awake. The Harrisons thought they could crush me, grind me into the dirt like a discarded brick. They were wrong. For 6 months, I'd been building something far stronger than any house I'd ever constructed, a case that would tear their empire apart, brick by gilded brick. It started after Claire's birthday, when Edward's toast about finding her equal left a sour taste stronger than the blood in my mouth tonight. I knew then that the Harrisons weren't just mocking me, they were plotting to erase me from Claire's life. I wasn't going to wait for their next move. I opened a secret bank account one Claire and her family couldn't touch. I bought a burner phone, started recording conversations, and began digging into the Harrison empire like a man possessed. My years as a contractor gave me an edge they never saw coming. I knew the underbelly of Boston's construction world: inspectors, engineers, city clerks. The invisible people Edward treated like dust under his polished loafers. My first ally was Sarah O'Connor, a former City Hall employee fired by Dennis Langston's cronies for refusing to falsify bidding records. I met her at a diner in South Boston, her hands trembling as she slid a USB drive across the table. "This is everything I saved before they kicked me out," she whispered, her eyes darting like a cornered animal. The files were a goldmine: contracts awarded to Harrison Development with bids that undercut competitors by pennies. Approvals rushed through despite safety violations. "They're rigging the game," Ethan Sarah said, her voice low, and Dennis makes sure no one asks questions. I thanked her, slipping the drive into my pocket like a loaded gun. Then came the bombshell, the kind that made my blood run colder than the December wind. 3 weeks ago, I was working late at a construction site in Roxbury when Mike Carter, a young building inspector, pulled me aside. Mike was barely 25, his face pale under the sodium glow of the streetlights. "Ethan, I can't keep quiet anymore," he said, his voice cracking. He told me about a Harrison project, a low-income housing complex funded by their Hope for Orphans charity. It was a front. The buildings were shoddily constructed with faulty wiring and weak foundations. Last year, a worker died when a scaffold collapsed, and Edward paid off the family to keep it out of the news. Mike showed me photos of the site, cracked beams, exposed wires, a disaster waiting to happen. "They threatened to ruin me if I didn't sign off," he said, tears welling in his eyes. "They said I'd never work in Boston again." That wasn't the worst of it. Digging deeper, I uncovered something that turned my stomach. The housing project wasn't just a scam to pocket charity funds. It was a cover for a drug trafficking ring. Harrison Development's warehouses, built under the guise of community storage, were being used to stash shipments for a cartel. I found the evidence in city archives buried in mislabeled permits deliveries to sites at 2 a.m., guarded by men who weren't construction workers. One night, I tailed a truck from a Harrison site to a Back Bay restaurant, where Edward and Dennis met a man I later identified as Victor Salazar, a known figure in the DEA's files. I snapped photos from my car, my heart pounding as their laughter echoed through the night. They were toasting to millions while workers died and kids went homeless. I didn't stop there. Over 6 months, I became a shadow in Boston's underbelly, collecting pieces of a puzzle that would bury the Harrisons. I recorded conversations with disgruntled employees, bribed inspectors, and contractors who'd been strong-armed by Dennis's political muscle. I cross-checked every document, every bank transfer, every shady deal. My apartment became a war room. Walls covered with sticky notes and timelines. I built a dossier, 800 pages of contracts, photos, audio files, and witness statements, all backed up on 15 devices and 3 encrypted cloud servers. One folder labeled Armageddon held the crown jewel evidence of Edward and Dennis's meetings with Salazar, complete with timestamps and GPS coordinates. This wasn't about saving my marriage anymore. Claire had made her choice, standing by her father's side as he humiliated me. This was about justice for the worker who died under Edward's negligence, for the kids whose charity money was stolen, for every person the Harrisons and Langstons had crushed to build their empire. I wasn't just a bricklayer anymore. I was a wrecking ball, and their glass castle was about to shatter. As I sat in my dimly lit kitchen, the snow piling outside, I opened my laptop and checked the dossier one last time. Every file was in place, every detail verified by 3 independent sources. I wasn't going to accuse Edward and Dennis. I was going to bury them so deep they'd never see daylight again. My phone buzzed, snapping me out of my thoughts. It was Claire. "Ethan, you need to come back to the mansion," she said, her voice tight with something I couldn't place fear, maybe, or guilt. "Dad knows something. He says it's serious." I smiled into the darkness, my fingers hovering over the send button on an email addressed to the FBI, the Boston Globe, and Channel 5. Edward thought he had the upper hand. He was about to learn how wrong he was. The Harrison mansion loomed like a fortress of glass and stone as I stepped out of my car, the snow crunching under my boots. The taste of blood was gone. replaced by a fire that burned hotter with every step toward the grand double doors. Edward thought he'd broken me with his fist and Claire's betrayal. He thought he could summon me back to grovel, but I wasn't the same Ethan Tran who'd walked out of that Christmas party an hour ago. I was a storm, and their world was about to be torn apart. Edward waited in the library, a glass of bourbon in his hand, his damp shirt swapped for a crisp new one. The room smelled of leather and old money, with mahogany shelves, lined with books he'd never read. Claire stood beside him, her red gown a stark contrast to her pale face, her eyes red-rimmed as if she'd been crying. Lillian perched on a velvet chaise, her diamond necklace glinting like a warning. Dennis Langston leaned against the fireplace, his counselor's pin gleaming under the chandelier's glow. "Sit down," Ethan Edward said, his voice thick with venomous satisfaction. "We have a lot to discuss." I remained standing, arms crossed, my jaw set. "I'm fine right here," I said, my voice steady as steel. Edward's smirk faltered for a split second before he opened a manila folder on the table, spreading out photos like a dealer laying down cards. They were shots of me entering City Hall, talking to inspectors, photocopying documents in a dimly lit archive room. 6 months of sneaking around, Edward sneered. "Very impressive for a bricklayer. What were you doing?" "Ethan spying on my family." Claire's eyes met mine, her voice trembling. "Ethan, why were you digging into my family's business?" The disappointment in her tone was almost laughable, as if I'd been the one to betray her. I leaned forward, my gaze locked on Edward. "Because you've been planning to destroy me for months," I said calmly. "And I'm not as stupid as you think." Edward slammed his fist on the table, the crystal glasses rattling. "You're a parasite, Ethan. A nobody who tricked my daughter into marrying you, thinking you could claw your way into our world." Dennis chuckled, stepping forward with a predator's grin. "You're out of your league, kid. I've already spoken to a judge friend. One call, and your little tax-dodging side jobs from years ago will land you in jail for a decade." He leaned closer, his breath reeking of cigars. "And when I'm done, no contractor in Boston will touch you. You'll be begging for work in a ditch." Claire's voice broke the tension. "Dad, Dennis, please," she said. But Edward cut her off with a sharp gesture. "Quiet, Claire. You've done enough damage marrying this leech." He turned to me, his eyes blazing. "But it's over, Ethan. We've got a better plan for Claire." He slid another photo across the table, a candid shot of Claire laughing with Thomas Whitman at a rooftop bar. "Thomas's family is worth $200 million. Their construction firm will merge with ours, and Claire will finally have the life she deserves." The room spun for a moment, Claire's silence louder than any punch. I looked at her, searching for a flicker of defiance, a sign she'd fight for us. Instead, she lowered her eyes, her hands twisting in her lap. "Ethan," she whispered, "it's for the best. Dad's right. We're from different worlds." Her words were a blade slicing through 3 years of promises of late-night talks about building a life together. She'd chosen her father's money over our marriage, and she'd done it with Thomas Whitman waiting in the wings. That's when I smiled, the kind of smile that made Edward's brow furrow and Dennis's grin fade. "You're right, Edward," I said, pulling my phone from my pocket. "I don't belong in your world, but I'm about to burn it to the ground." I opened an email draft, the subject line glaring in bold, "Harrison Development Empire of Crime." The recipients included the FBI, the Boston Globe, and Channel 5's investigative desk. "You thought you were hunting me," I said, my voice low and sharp. "But I've been hunting you for months." Edward lunged for the phone, but I stepped back, holding it out of reach. "Don't bother," I said. "This is just one of 15 devices. The files are on encrypted cloud servers you'll never touch." I swiped to a photo of Edward and Dennis at the Back Bay restaurant, laughing with Victor Salazar, the cartel's frontman. "Fraudulent contracts, rigged bids, money laundering through your Hope for Orphans charity." I said each word a hammer. "And let's not forget the drugs. Your warehouses are stashing more than cement, Edward." Dennis's face turned ashen, his counselor's pin suddenly looking like a cheap trinket. "You're bluffing," he stammered, but his voice shook. Lillian gasped her hand, clutching her necklace as if it could protect her. Claire stared at me, her mouth open, but no words came. Edward's eyes narrowed, his voice a low growl. "You don't have the guts to go through with this. You're nothing but a dirty-handed contractor playing detective." I leaned in, my smile widening. "You know the difference between us, Edward. You underestimated the wrong man. I thought you were just a bully. I didn't know you were a criminal who'd let workers die and steal from orphans to fund your cartel friends." I tapped the phone screen, the email's send button glowing. "You have until 7 a.m. tomorrow to withdraw your threats and confess to the police. If not, this dossier hits every newsroom and federal office in Boston. The FBI's already on standby." The silence was deafening, broken only by the ticking of the grandfather clock in the corner. Edward's face was a mask of rage, but for the first time, I saw fear flicker in his eyes. Dennis muttered something about his judge friend, but it was hollow, a desperate grasp at power slipping through his fingers. Claire reached out, her voice barely a whisper. "Ethan, please, don't do this." I looked at her, the woman I'd loved, now a stranger in a red gown. "You made your choice, Claire," I said. "Now live with it." I turned and walked out, the library doors closing behind me with a heavy thud. The snow fell thicker now, blanketing Boston in white, but my blood ran hot. In 1 hour, the FBI would raid Harrison Development. Edward and Dennis thought they could bury me, but I'd just lit the fuse on a bomb that would blow their empire to pieces. The Boston skyline glittered through the falling snow as I drove away from the Harrison mansion, my phone buzzing with notifications. The email was sent. 800 pages of damning evidence contracts. Photos, recordings were now in the hands of the FBI, the Boston Globe, and Channel 5. Edward Harrison and Dennis Langston thought they could bury me with threats and a judge in their pocket. They were about to learn what happens when you underestimate a man who's got nothing left to lose. At 7 a.m., the city woke to chaos. I sat in my Dorchester apartment, a cup of black coffee cooling on the table, watching Channel 5's live feed. Federal agents swarmed Harrison Development's sleek downtown headquarters, their black SUVs blocking Tremont Street. Men in windbreakers hauled out boxes of documents, their faces grim under the flash of news cameras. Edward Harrison was led out in handcuffs, his tailored suit rumpled his face, a mask of shock and fury. The camera zoomed in as he stumbled a neighbor in a silk robe gasping from the sidewalk. Across town, Dennis Langston was arrested at his Back Bay office, his counselor's pin glinting uselessly as agents dragged him past a crowd of stunned aides. My phone rang. It was Agent Rodriguez, a gruff FBI contact I'd met through a contractor friend. "Ethan, you weren't kidding," he said, his voice heavy with urgency. "Your dossier was the missing piece. We've been tailing Harrison for 2 years, but we never had enough to move. Those photos of him, with Salazar pure gold." I leaned back, a grim smile tugging at my lips. Plot twist number 5. I hadn't just built a case, I'd been feeding the FBI intel for 3 months, playing the anonymous tipster, while Edward thought he was the hunter. Warrants are out for their entire operation, Rodriguez continued. This goes deeper than you know. Politicians, contractors, even a DA's office clerk. You've opened a Pandora's box. By 8 a.m., the story exploded. The Boston Globe's headline screamed, "Harrison Empire built on fraud and drugs." CNN and MSNBC picked it up, reporters dissecting the Hope for Orphans scam that funneled millions to cartel fronts. Social media erupted, Bostonians raging over the betrayal of a children's charity and the death of a worker covered up by Edward's payoffs. In America, where trust in public figures and philanthropy is sacred, this was a gut punch to the city's soul. My phone buzzed again. Claire, her voice hysterical. "Ethan, the feds are here. They're tearing apart Dad's office. He's screaming that you forged everything, that it's a setup." I sipped my coffee, my voice calm as ice. "Tell Edward he has 30 minutes to make a statement before this becomes a national circus. The press conference is at 9. His choice." She sobbed, her words breaking. "How could you do this to us?" I almost laughed. "Us, Claire. You chose your father's world over ours. You knew about the drugs, didn't you?" Silence. Then a choked whisper. I didn't know everything. Just enough to stay quiet." Plot twist. Number 6. Claire wasn't just a bystander. She'd known about her father's dirty deals, choosing silence to protect her gilded life. "You sold out kids and workers for a $20,000 handbag," I said. "Live with that." I hung up, her sobs echoing in my ears. At 9 a.m., I turned on the TV. Marcus Thompson, Channel 5's anchor, stood in front of Harrison Development, his voice sharp. "In a coordinated operation, the FBI has executed search warrants following allegations of fraud, money laundering, and drug trafficking tied to Harrison Development and City Councilor Dennis Langston. Sources confirm a whistleblower provided irrefutable evidence exposing one of Boston's largest corruption scandals." I leaned forward, watching federal agents carry out computers and files. The camera panned to Edward's mansion, where neighbors gawked as more boxes were loaded into vans. Edward tried to fight back. At 10 a.m., my phone lit up with a call from him. "Ethan, you're destroying innocent lives." He roared, his voice unrecognizable with desperation. "Claire had nothing to do with this. Name your price. $2 million, $50 million. I can wire it now. I recorded every word." My smile cold. "Edward, you just added bribery to your rap sheet. The FBI will love this." I forwarded the recording to Agent Rodriguez, who texted back, "Keep them coming. We're building an airtight case." By noon, the Harrison Empire was in ashes. Edward faced 30 years in federal prison on 18 charges: fraud, money laundering, bribery, and racketeering tied to the cartel. Dennis got 15 years for rigging city contracts and obstructing justice, his political career reduced to a footnote. Harrison Development was dissolved, its assets seized to pay restitution to the city and the defrauded charity. Lillian, once dripping in diamonds, was spotted working as a receptionist at a budget motel in Worcester, her arrogance replaced by a hollow stare. Claire packed her bags for Oregon, trading her designer gowns for a job at a small farm, her face gaunt with the weight of her choices. I sat in my apartment, the TV still buzzing with news of the scandal. Claire's confession lingered like a bitter aftertaste. She'd known about the drugs, the lies, the worker who died under her father's negligence. She'd chosen to protect her family's wealth over the lives they'd ruined. "Ethan," she'd said in a final voicemail, her voice breaking, "I was wrong. I was weak. I don't expect forgiveness, but I'm sorry." I deleted the message. some apologies come too late. The city was still reeling, but I felt a strange calm. The Harrisons and Langstons had built their empire on the backs of people like me, workers, inspectors' kids who trusted their charity. I'd torn it down, not for revenge, but for justice. As the snow fell, outside blanketing Boston in white, I opened my laptop and checked the news. The headline on the Globe's website read, "Whistleblower Shatters Boston Corruption Ring." They didn't know my name yet, but they would. The storm I'd unleashed was just beginning, and its next wave would change everything. A year after that blood-soaked Christmas, I stood on the porch of my new home in Cape Cod, the ocean breeze carrying the salt of a hard-earned peace. The irony wasn't lost on me. I was living in the kind of place Edward Harrison said I'd never afford. But unlike his empire, mine was built on sweat and truth. Ethan Tran Construction had grown from a 5-man crew to a 500-strong force snapping up federal contracts left in the rubble of Harrison Development. We rebuilt Boston's infrastructure, bridges, schools, community centers, with fair wages and ironclad safety standards, setting a new benchmark for the industry. The Harrison scandal reshaped the city. Edward got 30 years, his legacy reduced to a cautionary tale on CNN. Lillian, stripped of her jewels, faded into obscurity as a motel clerk. Claire, now in Oregon, married a farmer and found humility in a life of honest work. I didn't hate her anymore. Her betrayal had forged me into something stronger. I was invited to speak at the Boston Chamber of Commerce, the theme integrity in business. Facing 300 executives, some who'd laughed at me that Christmas night, I began a year ago. A man punched me for spilling water on his shirt. His daughter, my wife, told me to apologize or leave. You saw a bricklayer who didn't belong. The room was silent, but I walked out determined. Integrity isn't just doing right. It's building a world where everyone gets a chance. I told of dismantling Edward's empire, of giving workers and kids a voice. The applause was deafening. The real reward came at a Dorchester community center we built, replacing a Harrison project abandoned for profit. A young worker, Carlos Rivera, approached me. "Mr. Tran, I was in jail for theft. No one gave me a shot until you." He grinned, holding a supervisor's badge. "You didn't just build buildings, you built my life." That moment was worth more than any mansion. Today, my company spans 8 states. I bought the Harrison Mansion at auction, turning it into a trade school for disadvantaged youth. 50 kids a year learn skills where arrogance once reigned. Edward's prison sentence has 29 years left. Claire's found her peace. Me, I found mine. The peace of a man who faced injustice and built something lasting. If this story of grit and justice moves, you subscribe for more tales of ordinary people toppling giants. Because in the end, integrity doesn't just win, it builds a world that endures.